Welcome back to Inside Nebraska's Recruiting Blitz podcast. I'm Tim Verghese, as always, getting the show kicked off with reaction to Nebraska's first 2026 commit. Sunday evening, Nebraska picked up the commitment of Dayton Raiola, 2026 quarterback out of Buford, Georgia. Obviously, younger brother of Dylan Raiola, son of Dominic Raiola, and nephew of offensive line coach Donovan Raiola. It's a family affair now officially at Nebraska. Obviously Donovan's on staff as the offensive line coach. Dylan's the freshman starting quarterback, going to be the starting quarterback for the next 2-3 seasons here at Nebraska. And you've also got now Dayton committed and their sister, Dylan and Dayton's sister, Taylor Raiola on the recruiting staff. So full on family affair with Dayton committed. As for what this means for Nebraska and just the initial reaction to the commitment, we'll start here. We said coming into the year and through the offseason, Nebraska is potentially looking to take two 2026 quarterbacks. I don't think Dayton's commitment changes that plan. We've talked about Michael Clayton. He was in town for the Colorado game, just like Dayton was. Those two have kind of started to form a bit of a relationship, having met back over the summer and then met again in the on in for the Colorado game. And for those two guys, I think building that chemistry early on is important for Nebraska, just because again, that there's been that discussion of potentially taking two quarterbacks. Clayton's aiming to make a decision in December. As of right now, Nebraska seems like the favorite to land that. But we'll see, kind of the ripple effects of Dayton's commitment and what that could mean for Clayton, as he's also considering Ole Miss, Louisville, Illinois, and a couple other programs, including Missouri. As for Dayton and what he brings to Nebraska, I don't think it's fair to him. I don't think it's fair to Dylan to compare the two. Just two very different backgrounds, two very different styles of quarterback, not styles of quarterback, but just different paths to get where they were. Dylan started as a freshman at Burleson out in Texas. Then the family moved, obviously to Arizona after his sophomore year, I believe. And he spent a year in Arizona, and then he spent obviously his senior year at Buford. But he was a starter pretty much all of high school. Wherever he went, he was a starter. He kind of took over, was clearly the guy pretty early on. Had kind of put it together as a freshman and just continued to develop and add more to his game. And by the time he got to his senior year, you kind of saw just a guy that was completely comfortable in the offense he was in, completely in control. And obviously, he stepped foot on campus in January, ready to start, and he's looked like the guy, obviously, through the first 4 weeks of the season. Dayton, it's a little more traditional for Dayton. He spent his freshman year at the JV to freshman level, kind of earning some reps there. Then as a sophomore last year, he spent backing up Dylan. He was a backup quarterback on varsity, but only saw some late game action, saw some garbage time game action, I guess is the best way to put it, last year. And he had to earn the starting job this offseason. He competed against a senior there at Buford, and earned the job outright through the first 5 weeks of their season. He's been the starter, and he's performed relatively well. Thrown for over 500 yards, has 4 touchdowns, has another touchdown on the ground. Does have 3 interceptions. If you go back and watch the film, I believe at least two of those aren't necessarily on him. It's good placement of the ball. But you see the bounces off the receiver's hands, or just slight miscommunication on the exact placement of the ball. You don't see a quarterback that's necessarily turnover heavy. You see another quarterback that is relatively safe with the ball in his hands, that does the little things right. I think what's really impressive about Dayton and Dylan, even at both of them at the high school level specifically, and you see it obviously translating with Dylan right now. But what's really impressive with both those guys is the little things they have ingrained in them. Both just taking drops. They both consistently kind of look off safeties, already have their eyes downfield to break down, what coverage they're looking at. You can see them processing in real time kind of what they're looking at. And that's just being the children of an NFL center, being the children of an NFL offensive lineman. They've learned these things from a very young age. It's these little things that go a long way down the line, and it's the little things that they already have taught into them that they won't need to pick up at the college level, or Dylan specifically hasn't had to necessarily pick up, just improve on. Dayton is kind of in that same mold in that sense. Dayton's a southpaw. I think that's something that's caught some people who haven't watched the film off guard. He is left-handed. Compared to, you see left-handed quarterbacks and the mechanics can sometimes look funky. It's not the case with Dayton. It's a very smooth release. It looks very natural. Closer to our own Zach Carpenter kind of wrote it after seeing him live back in June, but you kind of see a quarterback that throwing style is more like a Michael Vick type than like a Tim Tebow type. And there's been a lot made of left-handed quarterbacks and the release and what that can do for an offense. But there's no really concern there with Dayton's release, the way he kind of follows through the ball. You watch him throw it around, you see a quarterback that can spread it all over the field, has that big arm, just like Dylan. You don't see the flash as much as Dylan's did. But he's a guy that can with some time can uncork it 50, 60 yards downfield. We saw that already this season with a 56-yard touchdown throw. He had, I think it was week 4. But overall, with Dayton, I think that the important thing there is just to remain patient. Obviously, he's got 2 more years before he's even going to step foot on campus. He's expected that his first year on campus is going to be Dylan's junior year, so there's no expectation on him to start immediately. But it is worth noting specifically with Dayton, he's going to need some time. Like, you can see the tools. You see the tools of a quarterback that could potentially be a high level powerful quarterback. You see some traits. You see a guy that can create on the move, can do some of the arm angle stuff that Dylan can create off platform. Has some creativity to his game. Can also function within the structure of the offense. Does a good job of kind of spreading the ball out, especially throwing to the sideline, throwing outside the numbers. Does a really good job of throwing with touch and velocity. Has those things you really like, but it's tools right now. It's not. It hasn't come together for him the way it came together for Dylan, and that is going to take time. Like, just because of the fact that he hasn't played as much as Dylan has to this point. He needed to grow. Like, Dylan kind of came into high school 6'2", 6'3", and had that catcher build, that build he has now that he's only continued to add weight to and grow into. But Dayton, on the other hand, he was 5'10", 5'11", as a freshman and sophomore. Kind of shot up over the summers, now standing about 6'1", 6'2", and still looks like he can continue to grow. So and built a little differently. Dylan has some mass on him, some he's got some a good build on him, a little doughy, kind of like. Obviously the Patrick Mahomes comparisons are there, and that's because part of it is because they both are somewhat built the same. Dayton's lankier, Dayton's like a lankier quarterback, has some, so definitely some room to continue growing into his frame, and could obviously continue to grow physically as well. But like I said, going to need some time. I think that's the biggest thing here is just to be mindful of the fact that he's going to take at least a year to sit behind his brother and develop, keep putting the tools together. And then, after that, naturally, depending on the timeline, would be in competition with Nebraska's 2025 commit, TJ Lateef, or Nebraska's other freshman quarterback, Danny Kalen, who would also be competing for a job at that time. And so, he would enter a competition in year 2. So there's no real expectation here on Dayton to start immediately or even in year 2. It's kind of he's going to come in and compete, have an opportunity to kind of earn some reps and kind of work for what he's going to get. But again, this is one that's worth being patient on. But fascinated to continue following his development. I would encourage the fan base to remain optimistic as well, following his development. He's kind of you're seeing it already. This is his first year starting at Buford. You're already seeing from game 1 to game 5 the development that he's had, and how he'll continue to develop through this season, going into next season when he's the established starter. I'm very excited to kind of follow that development. Moving on from that kind of to some other recruiting news. Wanted to touch on this small group of visitors that were in town this past weekend. Nebraska had a very, very small group for the loss over Illinois. A Friday night game, which made it tough for Nebraska to get some recruits in. But they had a couple guys in, namely, in-state linebacker Jace Reynolds and 2027 in-state offensive tackle Matt Erickson, 2 guys that have been on campus a bunch this year. Reynolds, another 2026, is one to keep an eye on as potentially the next 2026 commit coming out off after Dayton's commitment. Nebraska's got a couple other options they're looking at, obviously in 2026, and there's no clear answer on who that next commit would be. I think most of these guys are trying to take their time with the process, are hoping to take official visits before making decisions. But there's a few out there Nebraska would like to lock down ahead of time. before moving on to some others in the class. Kind of turning the page and looking at some other developments just in the last couple of weeks or last week or so for Nebraska recruiting. Looking ahead to 2026, Nebraska made the top 10 for one of the top cornerbacks in the country, Victor Singleton out of Toledo, Ohio. He goes to Central Catholic out there. Ohio State and Michigan also in that top 10, Kentucky in that top 10, Tennessee, Wisconsin in the top 10. Nebraska's, in that mix. They're planning to get him in town for a visit later this season. He's a guy that Nebraska really likes. He's one of the top cornerbacks in the country. As of right now, he's a lengthier DB. I think you're starting to see that trend for Nebraska right now is they're trying to get these bigger corners specifically in town, guys that are 6 foot plus, ideally 6'1", 6'2" with some range that can cover some of the bigger receivers they see in the Big Ten. Singleton high early on in Ohio State and Michigan. I think it's going to be hard to pull him away from those two schools, but Nebraska's right in that mix. And John Butler, has the Huskers in some top DB recruitments right now. And we've kind of mentioned a couple other names along the way. Another one worth mentioning, Nebraska made the top 8 for 2026. Waco Connolly, 3-star cornerback, Jamarion Vincent. He's a bit of an athlete, can play a couple different positions. But cornerback's what he translates to best at the next level. Another one that's 6'1", 6'2" plus, rangy frame, has some good athleticism. Texas is involved there. A couple other national schools involved there. Nebraska's another one that Nebraska's hoping to get on campus at some point. Haven't been able to yet, but they've been maintaining some communication. If you really look at kind of what Nebraska's doing in Texas right now, they're really making their living in Dallas and up and down I-20, just going down to Waco, going down to San Antonio and touching in Austin a little bit, but San Antonio, Waco, the greater Waco area, going into Belton, going into Temple, and the Dallas Fort Worth area is kind of their bread and butter right now in Houston. Obviously, they have some offers out in Houston. Is their bread and butter down in Texas? Obviously, they have some offers out in Houston. Malcolm Simpson's a commit in 2025. We'll get to him in a second. They've had some success in the past recruiting programs like Shadow Creek, and have a former Shadow Creek assistant currently on staff, and Ira Savage Lewis. But Houston just hasn't been as fruitful from a recruiting standpoint, just in terms of the prospects that are in town, and the recruits that are in the greater Houston area right now. And also it's a city that has gotten especially a lot more competitive with Oklahoma and LSU, Texas A&M, Texas, and even all the other regional programs, Texas Tech, Baylor, TCU, et cetera, all prioritizing keeping prospects from the city of Houston in Texas. Houston under Willie Fritz has done a better job of recruiting the city. So Houston is just tough sledding right now. But on the flip side, Dallas is a state is a city Nebraska's had some success in, and on top of that is a growing city that I think right now, pound for pound, you could argue the high school football is as good as it's ever been there and as good as it is in the country, in the greater Dallas area. Just with the type of prospects coming out from all over the city, it's not localized in one area right now. It used to be localized in specific pockets, but now you're seeing prospects pop up all over the place, even out in Fort Worth, even out in North Dallas and South Dallas, all over, you're seeing prospects pop up. And so and with Nebraska's ties from Garrett McGuire to Matt Rule, just the ties they have in that state, specifically that part of the state, Nebraska's going to keep recruiting and keep going after. We mentioned Malcolm Simpson. Wanted to touch on 2 commits real quick in Nebraska's 2025 class. Worth monitoring just as other programs continue to pursue. Malcolm Simpson's one worth keeping an eye on. He was at Texas over the weekend to go see Texas dominate Louisiana Monroe. He's yet to visit Nebraska for a game. As most recall, he committed to Nebraska over the summer while on his official visit, the first visit he ever made to Nebraska. But Terrence Knighton and Matt Rule and the rest of the staff really earned his trust. Really earned, just his faith, just with Nebraska's own faith in him, and his talent. And Nebraska has kind of maintained a good relationship there. He's maintained that he's 100% committed. But Texas, has a spot. They're kind of looking for another defensive lineman. They have a couple options. Malcolm is one. They have not offered Malcolm Simpson yet. That's worth noting. There is, I don't see the Longhorns as a serious threat there until they offer. He's planning to be back in Austin for Texas's game against Georgia. As of right now, I kind of see that as a visit of just an opportunity to be on the sideline for an electric game, a game that he's is going to be one of the best in the country. I think he's just more so taking that opportunity right now. He's hoping to get up to Nebraska later this season, ideally November. Just what between flight prices and his own season, he's just not been able to schedule a visit till then. Nebraska would like to make that happen as soon as possible. And I think for a big reason for that is just trying to keep him committed. Last cycle they lost Carlin Jones late to USC. They don't want to see the same thing happen with Malcolm, who could, Texas is there. Texas A&M, monitored at one point. They could look to circle back. USC, has kind of put some feelers out there as well. So, this is a recruitment Nebraska would like to hold on to. And I think if they are able to, and if they do, it's going to be because of Terrence Knight and their relationship. Malcolm Simpson has Knighton's ties to that part of Texas. His relationship with Simpson's really good. Simpson kind of sees what Nebraska's D line does, sees the fit, can kind of line up all over the place. And he's had a dominant senior year so far, kind of playing in a new school at Hitchcock. Has a lot more eyes on him, kind of playing in a program that's contending for a state championship this year. Has some other D1 or Power 4 recruits specifically on the other side of the ball, so he's getting a little more attention as well, and he's taking advantage of it. Had a dominant performance last week against Belleville, another Texas Power, and kind of helped Hitchcock pull off the upset. So he's an interesting player, a player Nebraska would love to hold on to. And you look at that D line room. I've kind of maintained through the offseason. I really like the D line room that Terrence Knighton's put together. Or the D line class specifically, Terrence Knighton's put together between him, Cade Petrak, and Tyson Terry. Just three guys I think are going to have an opportunity to step on the field and contend for snaps immediately. Can play all over the line, kind of fit this world Nebraska is looking to build, where they're kind of positionless on both sides of the ball, and on the D line, they can line up all three of those guys, inside a three tech, even at the one tech for some of those guys, out to nine tech. They can be stand up edges. They can play all over that line, and Nebraska would like to see all three make it to campus, but it's not going to be easy to hold on to. Simpson specifically, Petrak's 100% locked in. Terry's locked in. And another commit, I guess, worth mentioning, and one, we've been writing about over at Inside Nebraska, and be sure to check out all our updates over at the Insiders board as well, where we post some scattershot recruiting updates as we get them, and as we catch up with these recruits. But one thing worth mentioning is another recruit we're mentioning is Jeremiah Jones, the athlete commit out of Murray, Kentucky. 6'5", legit 6'5". We finally were able to get eyes on him a couple of weeks ago when he visited for the Colorado game. And that was a big visit. Nebraska getting him back in town. We mentioned it after that weekend, how big it was for Nebraska to get him back in town. And it's especially big now in retrospect with Missouri kind of pushing. Missouri had him in town for a visit 2 weeks ago for their win over Boston College. So this week, he got to see Nebraska lose to Illinois, but he got to see Missouri struggle a little bit and have to, uh, need some late game heroics to kind of survive against Vanderbilt. Missouri is not necessarily doing them favors either, even as Nebraska lost. So I don't think it's a really head to head an advantage there. The big thing with Nebraska there is just going to have to be getting him back on campus. He's hoping to get back to Missouri at some point again this year. Nebraska would also like to have him back in town, and Nebraska can just keep continuing to sell him on the versatility, the development that happens at Nebraska. Missouri sees him as a tight end solely. Nebraska wants to try him at a couple of different positions. He's open to that. And, I think the big thing is just continuing to sell the family on Nebraska and on, the just opportunities at Nebraska and versus, the potential opportunity to stay closer to home and play in the SEC at Missouri. There was a reason he committed to Nebraska in the first place, and Nebraska's hoping to continue to remind him of why that is. But one worth monitoring, if you were to put odds on a commit to potentially not end up signing in December, I think right now Jeremiah Jones is the one most have circled or most are keeping an eye on, just because of the consistent attention that Missouri's given him, and the attention he's returning to that program. And besides that, again, like I mentioned, I don't think Nebraska's loss is going to affect this recruiting class really at all. If anything, again, it's something Nebraska can kind of use on the trail to kind of pitch other recruits on, potentially joining this program, being the guys that can, kind of help Nebraska make these marginal games not so marginal, kind of increase the odds for Nebraska to come out on top in these games where the margins are so tight. Dylan Raiola has continued to impress recruits. I think one thing we kind of mentioned before we get out of here, Cortez Mills, four-star Oklahoma commit, kind of reaffirmed his commitment to Oklahoma last week. Shut things down with an emphatic picture of him with the entire Oklahoma staff, Oklahoma's national championship trophies and conference championship trophies on Oklahoma's field. But it's worth. I think that recruitment. He says he's locked in. He says his recruitment's done. But words are one thing, actions are another. Nebraska was able to get him in town despite him initially saying after that Oklahoma commitment that he was locking things down. And we've mentioned before how strict Oklahoma kind of is with commits. This is one just monitoring just because of Oklahoma's quarterback situation. Nebraska's got Dylan Raiola for the next this season at least, and another 2 seasons. And Oklahoma, had to bench their five-star quarterback in Jackson Arnold for Mike Hawkins. A freshman, soft retro freshman quarterback out of Dallas, and a guy that is not as dynamic through the air as Arnold potentially could be. Oklahoma's got a bit of a quarterback conundrum on their hands. They have to answer that in the portal or go find someone else and through high school recruiting. There's a bit of a question mark for them right now. And depending on what happens this season, I think there's a chance not just Mills, but a couple other guys committed to Oklahoma could start looking around, and Nebraska would look to maintain positioning where they could potentially capitalize on that. But as for now, Mills is locked in, and he says he's locked in. He's shut down his recruitment. Obviously, Nebraska's going to keep checking in there. They're going to keep checking in on a couple other recruits. They're still working on Michael Terry. Sam Spiegelman over at Rivals had an update. Be sure to read that. We've pinned that over at the Insiders board. Be sure to read that update on as Texas and Nebraska and Oregon continue to battle in that recruitment. That's one that is turning into a bit of a roller coaster, one that Nebraska continues to ride, and for good reason. He's a 6'4" athlete, can kind of play all over the offense and can do so much for this team that Nebraska sees him as a dynamic fit in the offense that can kind of elevate and be that playmaker they kind of need. They obviously have Isaiah Mosey committed, Bryson Hayes committed, Jackson Carpenter and Tanner Turch both committed as well. Both those guys more seen as athletes than receivers, but have extensive high school tape at receiver, could fit in the receiver room. But Nebraska's looking for one of those big body outside receivers, someone that's dynamic, that can potentially see the field immediately. We see Mosey as a guy that can see the field immediately, but he's like 6'2". Nebraska would like a 6'3", 6'4" outside receiver or a receiver that's just better on the outside. They can go up and get the ball. Someone, when Jamal Banks and Isaiah Nayer aren't around, can be that dynamic outside receiving threat. They're developing Carter Nelson to somewhat be that. They're continuing to develop Malachi Coleman to be that, but they'd like to continue to backfill through high school recruiting as well. That's in a position I could see Nebraska also addressing in the portal once again. They did it last year with the aforementioned Banks and Nayer. They could try and do that again this cycle, and they're not going to have any shortage of options. I think recruits across the country, even current players across the college football players across the country, are taking note of Dylan Raiola's play and would like to catch passes from him. We can say that much already. And I think when the portal opens up in December, I think you're going to see Nebraska be an attractive option for recruits on both sides of the ball. If they just continue, if they're able to maintain and have success down the stretch of this season and kind of show that they're building something around their dynamic freshman quarterback. One quick note before we get out of here, on a 2026 receiver that we wrote about over at Inside Nebraska last week, Xavier McDonald out of Mississippi. He's one of the top receivers in the country, a top 100 receiver in the consensus. Rivals has him just outside the top 100. A dynamic 6'3" receiver that can really stretch the field. Is a bit raw, but developing and has some natural receiver traits, some natural length to him. Can create a little bit after the catch. He's getting down to Nebraska later this season for a visit. He's eyeing the UCLA game as that time to get to Nebraska. I think you're going to see as the season goes on. Nebraska has 3 home games left. Rutgers here in 2 weeks, where they're going to get a couple top 2026 and 2025 targets back in town. We'll have that list out here next week as that game gets closer and visits get confirmed. But some early names, worth watching there. Keenan Harris, the 4-star linebacker out of St. Louis. He's hoping to be in town for that. Jamarion Carlton, the 4-star defensive end, out of Temple, Texas. He's hoping to be both those guys are hoping to be in town for that. Those are the two headliners. We're expecting obviously more names, as that weekend gets closer. But I think as you see the season go on, they've got UCLA at the start of November. That visit weekend is going to become more important for Nebraska just because at that point, weather's still going to be good enough where they can get guys in town and still sell them on, playing in Nebraska, playing in that weather. Later in that season, they obviously have another home game against Wisconsin, but that's late November. You never know what that weather could look like. And with a lot of high school teams being deep in playoffs at that point, it'll be tough to get some top guys in town. It'll be more of guys that are out of the playoffs at that point, or guys that are pretty much or seasons have wrapped up at that point. And again, it'll have to be local guys just because again, anticipating early on, weather won't be great. It's tough to get national guys in for visits, late in the season. So keep that UCLA game circled. That's an opportunity for Nebraska to get another big recruiting visit day in, just because of the type of opponent as well. It's one where Nebraska should be able to win just with UCLA's early struggles. Nebraska should have an opportunity to kind of show off the offense, show off the defense a little bit in that game. Whereas, both Rutgers and Wisconsin look like a toss up, as we sit here, in late September and discuss kind of where Nebraska stands this season. But other than that, that'll probably do it for us here over at Inside Nebraska with the recruiting blitz. Just not as much to talk about just coming out of the weekend and going into the week. But these are just the main headlines we wanted to touch on. We'll have more updates throughout the week over at InsideNebraska.com. Obviously, we'll have more videos here at the Inside Nebraska YouTube channel, so stay tuned for that. But that'll do it for us, and we'll see y'all next week.